Hello, hello. So I'm a behavioral scientist and a neuroscientist by trade, and I got into retail and into innovation because I really wanted to change the world. Like it was this big, wild idea of wanting to make the world a better place. And so, long story short, I studied everything I could find in graduate school about how to help people and organizations transform, specifically organizations. And what I found was it all boils down to a very simplistic format, but there was no school teaching this individual thing or this unified theory of how things come together. And it really boils down to these books. I don't know if you've seen it, that there's or had these books growing up, but there's these awesome books called Choose Your Own Adventure books. And basically what you do is at the beginning of the book, you can see here, there's a number of different topics, but on the cover of the book, you get information about what the main topic is. And then the first couple of pages, you get information like what time it is. Is it 400 years in the future or the past, who you are, who your friends are, who your enemies are, and then the situation you find yourself in. And then you're presented with something really interesting, a series of choices. And then based on what you want to do, you flip to the right page and you learn more information and make more decisions and so on and so forth. That really is all of life. And what we've done in the world is we, in my view, over-optimize on the knowledge acquisition part. We're trying to learn. That's probably why you're here attending this event. That's all really well and good. But then what we've done as a society and as a people have said, well, if you gain a lot of insight and a lot of knowledge, then somehow you'll actually change and make better decisions. That's not always the case. And I think you probably have seen that in your own careers and in your own lives. Just because you know what to do or you believe you know what to do, there are so many other things that get in the way that get you from the thing you think that you should do to the thing that you should do and actually taking the actions. And it's quite difficult. So this was a study that was done years ago where these academics wanted to see if our faces in North America had changed collectively over the course of the last 100 years. This was a real study. And they took tens of thousands of yearbook photos and they ran it through this computer facial recognition software. And honestly, one of the only findings they found was that we smile more in pictures. And the reason why I bring this up is to say that we aren't changing very much. The hardware, the software, that's you, that's me, that's your kid, that's your boss, that's your spouse, that's your employee, that's your customer. We're all pretty much the same. What is changing around us, as I'm sure you've heard in the last little bit, is the world around us. This is the humble telephone during roughly the same time period. Now, if you think about all of the change that it represents, and this is just a little snapshot. This is exponential change in reality. Now think about all the changes just happened in your career, not your life, just your career. And if you think about it right now, this is the slowest amount of change that you'll ever see in your entire life. You'll look back at this time period and go, wow, that was so quaint. Remember the pandemic? That's when things just were about ready to take off. So if we feel like we're being overwhelmed, we are. We're not equipped with the right tools for the world that's coming. In generations past, you could have had the same job, worked in the same thing your entire life, your entire careers. We saw that with our grandparents for sure, maybe even our parents. But that's just not going to be the case for us, and certainly not the case for our kids. So if you go down to and you really get into like, what is our story? What are we getting into? So I just want to tell you a story. So if you think back way to 2012, it's hard to even remember now. 2012 was a kinder time, a simpler time. Barack Obama has just won a second term in office. As an American, it's been hard to be American lately. That's all I'll say about that. It's getting better. And then you've got Hurricane Sandy has wiped out a significant portion of the Northeast. We're seeing the effects of global climate change in a major Western populated center. They're still digging out, if you've been up there recently. And this guy was rocking the charts. Now, if you remember where you were the last time you organically heard Gangnam Style, it was probably 2012. Psy was omnipresent. And I worked at this place. I worked at a place called Lowe's. Lowe's, if you don't know what that is, Lowe's is a large Fortune 40 home improvement company. They spit out billions of dollars of free cash every year, and they're massive. But they are probably the most boring place on the earth. And that's why I went to work there. I had gone to academia and I had learned all these different things about how to make organizations transform. And I had created what I thought was a unified theory for how this would work, but I needed to prove it out. I started first at Walmart, which is another story for another day, which was awesome. And then I was recruited to Lowe's. And at Lowe's, I really got to put all these ideas together. But it really stemmed from this one thing where I was given the task of convincing executives to make a change. And it was a pretty simple change, I thought. And I did what you're supposed to do. Like, I gave a great presentation. I did all the research. I had all the great facts and figures that I was taught in my MBA class. And I get up and I gave the presentation, and the executive comes up to me afterwards and he says, "Kyle, what an amazing presentation. I'm not doing any of it." I was like, well, the whole social contract of doing presentations is that I can convince you with my superior rationale that you should change your behavior. And if I can't, as a behavioral scientist, get someone to change their behavior in a meeting, what am I doing? And so that's when it really bubbled up for me that I really had to make a change about how in the world we were going to actually apply these things that I had been preaching for so long, and that I really knew that we wanted to do. So I was able to, it's another story for another day, but able to get in there and to really make that big change. And from those things, I was able to convince folks that we should do all this stuff. And I ended up running innovation for Lowe's and started this thing called the Lowe's Innovation Labs. From there, we built exosuits for our employees. You can see in the left-hand corner there, we built the largest 3D scanning. We scanned all of our items. This was even years ago. And those items in the center there are completely digital. It's used for marketing, virtual, augmented, mixed reality. We partnered with Google and Microsoft and Magic Leap and many others to literally create new hardware and software and firmware using for augmented, mixed reality and virtual reality. We put a 3D printer in the International Space Station. It's still up there. That's a picture of the first thing commercially manufactured off the planet. It's a Lowe's wrench, and it has a clip because things fly away. And that was pretty awesome. That tool is actually in the Smithsonian now. We developed the largest virtual reality training. So if you want to learn how to do something, you do it in virtual reality. And last but not least, we built the first autonomous robots inside of stores. You talk to it, it talks to you, it speaks 25 different languages, it helps you find things around the store, and then it scans and creates inventory all throughout the store. The reason why I bring this up is to not focus on the things so much, but to say that any organization, even a really boring one, or one that's considered kind of an industry laggard, can do big things. We were awarded all kinds of big awards as a result of this. But really, when you get into it, it really comes down to this social theory, which had really been hammered out in the 1950s and 60s. And basically, when you boil it down, there are really only two types of organizations. One is this, and this is like 99.9% of all organizations are this: sequential. There's nothing wrong with being sequential. It's just normally how organizations become refined and efficient over time. These organizations are very good at producing whatever it is that they produce. They're very bad at change. And so the world around us as retailers is changing so much. There's really only one thing that collectively we decided in some weird sense to do to react to all of this change. And that is to start an innovation lab. Now, you might have an innovation lab, small or big, wherever it is. Let me tell you how this usually goes. You say, oh no, we don't have an artificial intelligence capability. Oh, what are we doing about whatever? Well, I know. Why don't we start an innovation lab? Why don't we go out and hire somebody that probably looks like me, but is probably an engineer, set up shop in whatever hipster part of the town it is that you're based in, or all of San Francisco, and then buy a bunch of 3D printers and do all kinds of cool stuff. And then, all of a sudden, that's supposed to solve all the innovation problems. Now, for all of the companies that have really expensive, massive innovation labs, there's been very few transformational things coming out of them, because the primary problem is not one of we lack the skills. The primary problem is, what are we doing? And so all of my research, again, boiled down to this one thing, which is this unified theory, which then I proved out later. I wrote a book on Harvard Press called Leading Transformation. And my co-authors and I, it wasn't just me, but we interviewed executives like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and then much lesser known folks that are doing equally amazing things. And it really boils down to these three things. If you have these three capabilities, you can do incredible things. If you don't, things tend to fall apart. The first one is all organizations need a strategic narrative. And that is a big, cogent, understandable, big, very clear view of the future with very little detail of how to get there. A good example of that is the classic moonshot from President Kennedy before the space program really took off. Now, if you think about the time that was in, we had the West and the United States specifically had just gotten whipsawed by the Russians and the Soviets when they put Sputnik into space. And we were all so scared, but even more importantly, embarrassed that they beat us. And so what did we do? What did Kennedy do? He got up and he said, we are going to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely again before the end of the decade. And he was very clear about the specifics of who the protagonists were, who the antagonists were, what we were going to do, and what the time frame was. What he didn't say was specifically how we were going to do that. That was up to somebody else. The next thing then is, once you know what you want to do, then you got to go break the bottlenecks in your organization to get that going. Literally laying out point for point what needs to happen so that you can get your big idea into the machine so it can start to work. For all of the talk about being customer centric, if your idea can't get through your organization, or if your service can't get through your organization to get to the customer, you will never be customer centric. The first customer centric thing you can do is to get through your organization and break those bottlenecks. And then the last thing is to develop new KPIs of the future. One surefire way to kill something new is to use mature metrics of success on something new. You know, Kodak is always the poster child for doing it the wrong way, and that they developed the digital camera. Those people spent millions and millions of dollars and years developing the digital capability, but they ultimately decided to pass on it strategically because when they were comparing the two things, they were comparing them for dollars. And there was no way that this nascent little digital business was going to compete in the short term with the very profitable paper and chemicals business. But if they had looked at it from a different standpoint and looked at resolution increasing and exponentiality and their ability to be able to get resolution and per penny or per dollar, they would have seen that the digital camera was far and away better than the paper and chemical business. So if you use, again, different metrics, you can see the future in a different way. So I would say, if you're going to try to do something new, do not use a mature metrics of success. Specifically, do not use sales. So really what it gets to, again, is how do you make change? And when I was doing studies, what I would do is I would put EEG headsets on people, and I would run them through different scenarios of how to explain new information to them. And I would try to convince them to do things based on the information available. Usually it was around working out more or eating better, really basic stuff. And I would track them over time to see how they did and if they actually changed their behavior. And what I found is that the only real mechanism that worked across the board, didn't matter what your gender was, didn't matter what your income was, it didn't matter what your age was. All that mattered is if it was in a story. If it was inside of a story, you could do big, incredible things. If it was taught in kind of or conveyed in a bulleted kind of pithy way, people would agree with you in the moment and then would not change their behavior. So basically everything we're taught in business school is the least efficient way to actually create meaningful change. And so what I did was seeing that effect and seeing how people's brains would literally light up when I would just say the phrase, "Can I tell you a story?" I then went to the literary sciences department and really spent a lot of time researching and learning the best way to tell stories. And I got into Star Wars and Jurassic Park and some of the great keystones of our collective popular culture and what drove those things. And they had really solved these problems largely. And they had created what would be the framework that I would say, okay, well, if it works for Star Wars and it works for Jurassic Park, why can't I apply this in a traditional corporate world? And so I did. I convinced our CEO at the time at Lowe's to let me go and hire professional published science fiction writers, give them all of our marketing research and trend data, and send them into the future 2 years, 10 years down the road. And we could see in that snapshot of a future that doesn't exist, think Back to the Future Part 2, what things could be and how all of these new technologies and new social situations might actually show up in the real world, and how that would affect our employees. And even more importantly, I'd say how it would affect our customers. And you can see that again in a comic book or in a video or something else that is accessible, that we're used to receiving new information in, and it's an engaging way without getting into the bulleted PowerPoint nonsense that we usually convey information in. Because fundamentally, the thing that makes us human is that we are obsessed with stories. How many times have you stayed up way too late watching some dumb show or binge watching something that you've already seen 10 times before, probably, knowing full well that you have to wake up early in the morning? We crave and love stories. And so why wouldn't we actually make organizational change that way? So from this first story, there's a couple redesigning their kitchen in their kitchen, and they're using what we would call heads-up display now, or mixed reality. And this is before Oculus Rift came out on Kickstarter. No one was talking about VR, AR in any meaningful way. And we were able to take that and to start to build, and to build faster than anybody else. We locked down IP, we locked down partnerships, we built a giant team. But ultimately what it was is I was managing the fear of the unknown for the people around me. Most of the executives around me fell into two camps. They were either super excited about the future because they were incentivized to create it, or number two, they were afraid I was going to destroy the thing that they'd built. Now, no one was saying those things out loud, but their behavior really showed that that's what was driving either their support for it or their fear of it. And so what I used was the proclivities and the normal stance of most organizations to love data. And so we were able to do classic research on every single thing we built. This was the first mixed reality and augmented reality store. This was back in 2012. And then we were able to, again, continue to iterate along the way, everything from the big box to all these different iterations using Magic Leap, working with Google and many, many others, all the way down to where it is now, which is to training inside of stores using virtual reality. And then also what's on your phone today, where you can place things inside of your home. And applying basic experimental design, like from social science, allows you to just very simply state what your hypothesis is and what the variables are that you're testing for. I'm always shocked when I work with people and organizations, whether it be governments or retailers. It's just so interesting how very few of them actually write down what their hypothesis is, why they're doing certain things, and then where they're going, which then leads again to, like, how do you measure things that matter? You measure things that matter by measuring things that matter. And the common denominator in most experiences is the human. So what we do is we put EEG headsets on people that measure attention, memory activation, cognitive load, anxiety, arousal. And then we can see how different environments, whether they be on the shelf, in a digital world, and a combination thereof, really affect the brain and the decision capabilities of the person. And we did that with Google. And I won't go into the story now, but it's well documented. Feel free to look it up. There's a bunch of Harvard Press articles about it and other things about how we were able to use applied neuroscience to be able to figure out what the future should be, and then to decide that this is the form factor that we should take. Again, if you don't have a way of identifying what your hypothesis is and then the variables that you're testing, you won't know what metrics to look at. Back to the Kodak example, are you looking at the sales metrics or are you looking at the resolution metrics? And those are the hard things to do. So since I left Lowe's about 2 years ago, I started a company to take these various things between virtual reality training and then also combining that with applied neuroscience, because so many employees are so disengaged and they really do feel that they are not reaching their potential. And the primary thing is we are so bad at training and learning in this environment, in this world where things are moving so quick. Our universities and our systems, our traditional systems, are failing us. And so how do we learn faster than just having one person talk at you like I'm doing now for hours? There's got to be a better way to make it bespoke in the moment to keep you in the flow. And so that's what we do by combining VR and applied neuroscience. We put EEG headsets in context with a virtual reality headset. And then what happens is, based on how you're experiencing the learning environment. So like in this virtual reality world, based on if it's too hard, too easy, if you're engaged, not engaged, the environment will dynamically change to make it the most optimal for you. And so that makes it about 80% more effective than having the best teacher stand right next to you and teach you the entire time. And we're using that right now for some things that are really important, like diversity and inclusion training and hard skills training and soft skills training, like how do you deal with a difficult customer and how do you deal with a board meeting? Those kinds of things are really important. I bring this up to say that there are solutions to just about any problem that you have if you're willing to combine things that have not been combined before and apply them in ways that haven't been combined before. So if you go back to the research that I had done, people always ask, okay, well, that's all great. What are some of the skills? Like, how do I know if I have the right team to be able to do some of these things? And this isn't just about being innovative. This is survival. I think especially this pandemic has taught us all that. And from all this, the skills of the transformative team are really quite simple. One is what John Keats called negative capability. People on your team need to have this negative capability. They need to have comfort with uncertainty. Everything is uncertain. And we as humans are really good at stamping out things that make us uncomfortable. But there are a few folks that are very, very good at just kind of dealing with it and living in it. And finding those folks is very, very healthy inside your organization. So find those folks, protect them, and keep them inside. The next thing is, if you have people that are good at kicking up opportunity and uncertainty, you need to have what we call our chaos pilots, people that can create structure out of this chaos. And those people are usually the most annoying people at your company. These are the people like at Friday at 5 p.m. that are like, hey, that thing that we've been working on all week, I just discovered that actually that's not going to work at all. We need to fix it. Those are the people that are not necessarily lauded and awarded, but they're the ones that are really critical. And then lastly, you have to, those really great people are driven primarily by their own personal narrative. So they need to have a personal story of how what they're doing actually translates into the greater work. And we've all had those experiences where if you have those great experiences, like if you really know what you're doing is laddering up to something bigger, you can do big and marvelous things. And if you don't, it all kinds of falls apart. And I just want to say one thing. The last thing is, going back to my story about John F. Kennedy, this is probably an apocryphal, not true story, but it illustrates my point. You know, after he had done his famous moonshot speech, he was going through and visiting a NASA facility. And as presidents often do, he stopped to talk to a janitor. And the man was either sweeping or mopping. He said, "Sir, what do you do here?" He said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." That guy went home every night. And I've talked to a lot of these folks that had relatively, meager, minor jobs in the grand scheme of things, but they were driven by purpose. And it doesn't just have to be a moonshot. We've all been in those experiences where if our personal narrative and the narrative of the organization are linked together, people will do incredible things and feel so engaged and so happy. And I would again ask, what is the strategic narrative of your organization? If you don't have those three things that I laid out, you can find ways to address them so that you can get back on track. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Carl. Fantastic stuff. So I just got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. Number one is, I don't know if you've read any Geoffrey Moore. He wrote this Crossing the Chasm and all these kind of books. And he says one of the biggest stresses a company can undergo actually is in that transformation, is going into that J-curve. And it's the bit where you start to tip down before you hockey stick up. How do you get people to stick with you when things are looking tough?
Yeah, that's so it's the same thing with the hype curve and all of that fun stuff. Right before something is obvious, it's considered insane, and that's always the thing. I think the bigger thing is laying out if people aren't buying into what you're saying, or you're losing your own belief. Either the thing that you're doing is incorrect, which is possible, but probably more often than not, it's usually just because you're not telling your story correctly. People have traversed this whole planet with nothing more than a knapsack and a jacket, on the basic belief that there's something bigger over the horizon. And we can do incredible things if that's the case. But we will mutiny the first possible moment if we believe that it's not anymore. So I would go again, it's probably based on lack of a cogent, coherent, impactful, important story. And whenever I find that when things are starting to fall off the rails, which happens often when you do big and bold things, just telling the story again and again, why we're doing this, where it's going, and what this could mean for the organization.